Good morning or good afternoon. Haere mai. Uh, I'm Bryce Julyan. I'm presenting to you today on planning in Aotearoa, New Zealand, as part of the Planning Around the World series that's being put together by our CAP Emerging Planners. I will introduce myself a little now. I'm been a planner for about 40 years. I am a trustee on the board of the Commonwealth Association of Planners. That's the photo in the top right, which is our board meeting in Malaysia. Was it last year or year before? Year before, I think. I'm a fellow and former chair or president of the New Zealand Planning Institute, practice lead for planning at Beca, which is a New Zealand-owned international consultancy, and I reside in Auckland in New Zealand. The outline of my presentation, I will just briefly run through a history of planning in New Zealand. I'll talk about our current planning framework. I will touch on the Treaty of Waitangi and Maori because that is a unique relationship we have in the planning sense as well as in our nation. And I will then go on to just talk about some of the key challenges we're facing in New Zealand, which are probably very similar to other parts of the world. I'll use Auckland, our largest city, to illustrate some of the ways we're dealing with those. And then I'll talk about in conclusion, I'll talk about the reforms that we're going under at the moment, which is the reform of our planning framework. You'll see in the pictures that New Zealand is about as far away from the UK as we can get on the other side of the world in the Southern Pacific. Auckland is the largest city. That's in the upper North Island, and it has a population of about 1.7 and 1.8 million. Wellington and Christchurch are the two next largest cities. Wellington is the capital at the bottom of the North Island, and then Christchurch in the middle of the South Island. Briefly talking about the history of planning in New Zealand, I'll put it in context of the history of New Zealand. Maori migrated around 600, 800 years ago to Aotearoa, New Zealand. The Treaty of Waitangi is our founding document, and that was established in 1840 between the British Crown and Māori. And settlements were laid out in the 19th century and early 20th in grid patterns because the plans came from the UK, and they didn't really account for New Zealand landscape, which is a lot more undulating and sometimes quite steep compared to perhaps cities in Europe. But in that time, in that early part of the 1800s, early 1900s, as settlement increased, the urban issues started to develop as the population grew as well. The New Zealand garden cities and town planning movement started to emerge around that time in the early 1900s. But it wasn't until 1926 the first Town Planning Act was passed, and that was for municipal or urban planning schemes to be developed for the municipal areas by separating land uses and the use of basic zoning. Around between the wars as well, the state housing movement and the quarter-acre ideal established itself. So the idea that state housing was provided through the government and people could get a house and a quarter-acre plot of land to live on, and that has been an ideal in New Zealand for probably 100 years. The 1953 Town and Country Planning Act was the next piece of legislation that replaced the earlier one, and that required all councils to zone. So that included rural land as well as urban. And around the 50s was the time that car culture started to arrive in New Zealand. First motorways were established, and it really was a transition in time for our urban centres, particularly because people moved away from public transport and started relying on private vehicles, which, when the population was low, or still only low in terms of millions of people, and now that we're reaching 5 or 6 million people, it is becoming a lot more of a problem. 1977, the Town and Country Planning Act came in, and that devolved responsibility to local authorities. So that up until then, central government had taken an active role in planning. This act really introduced that devolution down to the local authorities, the councils, to administer. And then in 1991 was the introduction of the Resource Management Act, which is our current planning framework. And the RMA introduced with the idea to provide integrated land use and natural resource management, and it combined over 50 separate pieces of legislation that were in place at the time. So natural resource management, land, air, water, as well as social, cultural and economic well-beings were introduced into the purpose of the Act. It currently provides a statutory framework for planning and resource management in New Zealand, so that's 30 years old, 30 coming up to 35 years old. There are other statutes that are relevant, relate to things like land transport, wildlife and heritage, but the RMA is the document and the framework that brings it all together, which we use as planners. Part 2 of the RMA is noted in case law here as the engine room of that legislation. And its purpose is to promote the sustainable management of natural and physical resources. And that's laid out in the bottom of my slide there as to how we interpret that. But that also talks about providing for our well-beings, and that the use and development of resources would be in a way or at a rate that enables us as communities, as people, to provide for that well-being. It is an engine room because for planners, the Part 2 provisions really provide that ability to weigh the different competing interests or tensions in developing a plan or assessing a proposal. So it's a very important part. It's that sort of what they call the engine room, because it drives the way we pull all the different elements together and weigh them up. First of all, there are matters of national importance that are recognised, and they must be recognised and provided for, and they include natural character of coastal marine area, wetlands, lakes and rivers, the protection of things like outstanding natural features or significant indigenous vegetation from inappropriate use and development, maintaining public access to coastal areas, lakes and rivers is a fundamental thing here in New Zealand. It's enjoyed by the public that generally we have public access to the edges of our seas and rivers and lakes. The relationship of Maori and their culture and traditions with their ancestral land, water and sites of significance is also a critical part or matter of national importance that we must recognise and provide for, along with the last point there, which is the management of significant risks from natural hazards. There are other matters that must be considered, and carefully weighed, and these include kaitiakitanga, which is the sort of guardianship and stewardship that is exercised by Māori. There's the ethical stewardship generally, for all of us have a duty to steward resources and consider those in our day-to-day going work. And then there's a number of different ones there, which I won't go into too much, but they're really about maintaining quality of the environment, enhancement of amenity, ecosystems, and taking into account things like climate change. There is also touches there on renewable energy and the end use of energy. The Treaty of Waitangi I mentioned before, and that's very critical to the relationship with Māori and the way we undertake planning in New Zealand. So under the treaty, the concept of tino rangatiratanga or chieftainship is quite critical. It's about a partnership between the Crown and Māori. So the idea that that planning needs to be done in partnership with those particular Māori groups who have an interest in the land or the area that we're working in. And that can often include, and I'll talk about an example later on, about maybe co-governing some of these assets or natural features. But the important thing there is that the treaty was established between the Crown and Māori, and that partnership is a key principle of the treaty. And in the intervening years, that has probably not been as respected as it should have been. In fact, many would say it's been ignored. That has changed, and now the treaty is enshrined in our in the RMA, and so it is something that we have to work with and take into consideration, remembering that the treaty is between the Crown and Māori and the local government and national direction and regional governance, and that it relates to planning is an extension really by virtue of legislation and so forth from the Crown. So the RMA framework that we work in is driven, first of all, at a national level by documents under the RMA that are called national policy statements, and these provide national direction on specified matters. There are also national planning standards which achieve consistency and definition across the regions and districts within the country that we are required to adhere to or to work within the framework that the way the national planning standard sets it up. There are 11 regional councils, and you can see them in the coloured map to the right. The regional councils straddle district and city councils, so within their regions there may be several districts and cities, but there are 78 local authorities or councils in New Zealand, and that includes regional, district, and includes about 6 unitary authorities, which include Auckland and Gisborne and Marlborough, and they perform the functions of both, so they're united authorities that perform both regional functions and district level functions. The regional policy statement is a key policy direction document that must be followed within your region. So district plans need to give effect to their respective regional policy statement. So it's a high level overview of resource management issues for that region, and it sets out objectives, policies, and methods to manage those regionally significant issues. And so regional plans then go ahead and provide more detailed rules and regulations relating to the policies or implementing the policies of the RPS that focus on specific resources, particularly to do with natural resources around the country. I said before, there are within the number of territorial local authorities, there are 67 territorial local authorities or councils, and they're depicted in the map on the right. Now, 6 of them are unitary authorities, as I've noted, but there are 53 districts, 13 cities, and the Chatham Islands Council, which it looks like my cameo is blocking, but to the southeast of the country, of the main islands, is a small group of islands called the Chatham Islands. At district planning level, the plans focus on the use and development of land within the district. They plan for growth, for land use, so urban growth, or could be urban or rural land use, or different kinds of land use. Effects management, so such as noise and that, natural hazards and contaminated land. So those are the matters that are dealt with at a district level or a local council or city council. I think the current challenges probably very similar to those faced by many cities around the world and even countries like our own. Housing, both affordability and availability, is a current challenge. Infrastructure supply and the need to keep up supplying infrastructure to support housing growth, and also infrastructure that supports inter-regional growth and connections across the country. Climate resilience is obviously a pretty major issue for everyone. It's certainly something, and I'll talk about some examples later on, that we are very aware of here, particularly in relation to climate events such as heavy storms or rainfall. And quite a unique challenge for us, I think, is the Maori Partnership. I think that while we have made strides there to improve that, and that there is a lot of debate at the moment with the current reforms being considered about the role of Maori, and it would be very unlikely that will change, but the law and how we work within it may be altered under the reforms. I'm going to focus briefly on Auckland, Tamaki Makaurau. It's New Zealand's largest city, as I said. It's about 1.7, 1.8 million people. It's located in the very far, or in the north of the North Island, and it is built on a landscape of over 50 volcanic cones, dormant volcanoes, but nevertheless a very rugged terrain, and quite up and down, and those cones are very significant to iwi or Māori, as I'll talk about later on. It's located on a very narrow isthmus of land as well, between 2 harbours. So we have an east coast and west coast harbour. The east coast is the Waitemata and the west coast is the Manukau, and they mean that we have a lot of coastline. There's a very narrow land bridge that connects the lower part of Auckland to the rest of the North Island, and indeed you have to go right through the city to get to the northern part of Auckland and Northland and the far north of New Zealand. As I said, cultural values are strongly associated with the natural features here. That includes the health and quality of the harbours, the respect of the tupuna maunga, the volcanic cones, and other sites of significance to Māori. Transport is probably one of the big issues, significant planning issue in terms of transport infrastructure in Auckland. It used to be one of the most highly utilised cities for public transport. And as I mentioned, a move away from public transport to private cars largely occurred from about the 1950s. That coincided or resulted in the removal of the extensive tram network, the construction of motorways, and with the construction of motorways and car dependence, the problems of urban sprawl and indeed the need for heavy reliance on cars became embedded, I think, in the way the city developed and how it's continued to develop even today. The construction of the harbour bridge, you can see in the top right picture is a picture of the harbour bridge that connected to the north shore of the Waitemata harbour, and you can see the sun rising out to the east there. So we're looking from the north to the south in the city centre. On the other side, you can see the Sky Tower sticking up from the city centre. But the Sky Tower and the harbour bridge are probably the two most iconic structures in Auckland. The bridge was built in 1959 and extended in 1969, and that coincided with the rapid development of the North Shore. And the North Shore has a lot of beautiful East Coast beaches. So a lot of people used to holiday there, but with the extent or the expansion of the motorway network meant that the bridge opened up the North Shore to commuters to really come and work and live on the North Shore, but work in other parts of areas of Auckland. As the North Shore has grown, of course, employment has also grown over there, so there is movement both ways, but it is still a very much only driven primarily by cars. However, investment in public transport has occurred in the last 20, 30 years, and we have a northern busway, which is particularly effective, and that is one of the responses to try and reinstate or encourage the use of public transport, which it is doing very successfully. So again, as I said, the last couple of decades have seen a change in planning for better public transport, and we have rail upgrades, new train stations, a new city rail link that connects through the city CBD and connects the western and western line to what is currently a terminus station at the bottom of Auckland downtown to Waitemata station, and that creates two new stations in the city, which will add permeability and connectivity, as well as reduce travel times for many people, because the efficiency of that network will be quite astounding. And you can see one of the renditions of the central Auckland stations there on the bottom right. The North Shore Busway shown on the left, and of course cycling and walking is a really big or encouraged activity now, and the infrastructure investment in cycling and walking networks has been quite extensive. So we have a very robust network, and you can see the top right there, the pink pathway. The light path is the reuse of an old motorway off-ramp for cycling and walking around the city to get around the city from the west to the east and vice versa. I mentioned before the Te Puna Maunga Authority. Now, one of the issues here was that the maunga, the volcanic cones of Auckland, you can see two more here. There's Aotearoa, Mount Hobson, and Mangere, Mount Wellington. The value of them or the sacredness of them to the Maori tribes, the iwi and the sub-tribes, the hapus, is very important and had been, as I said, probably largely ignored in terms of its development over time. Although most of the cones have been protected, you can see things like reservoirs have been embedded in the top of them and so forth. The Te Puna Maunga Authority is a co-governance authority with representatives of Māori, mana whenua groups who have an affiliation to Tamaki Makaurau, to Auckland, and the council, and they're set up to manage the maunga in a more sustainable and culturally sensitive manner, which is the first real example of that, although there are others. The Waikato River is co-governed under an authority agreement as well. You can see on the right the Auckland volcanic field, and you can see how extensive it is. In the island in the top right is Rangitoto, which is in the distance of the photo on the left. You can see Mangawhao, Mount Eden, which is the mountain closest to the city centre, and that's looking north towards the city centre, and the harbour bridge over here, and the sky tower there. So returning the maunga to the co-governed authority enabled that authority to produce a single integrated sort of management plan across the different maunga. So there were different strategies that related to things like biodiversity or education or recreation, and that they applied across all the maunga. And then for each of the individual maunga, of which there are 14 maunga that have been handed back, the management plans are being produced or have been produced, which detail the management of specific to that maunga. Now I'll touch on housing and urban growth. That's obviously one of the key issues that's pressing on us in Auckland at the moment. Council have been focused on urban renewal in places like Wynyard Quarter, Hobsonville Point, and the City Viaduct Harbour, as these are shown in the top left there. And that has been really reflected in the plans that had rural-urban boundaries on the outskirts of the city, and trying to sort of develop or redevelop areas within the city boundaries, and that included new greenfield areas as well, but it was focused primarily around trying to redevelop and reuse urban land rather than keep sprawling. That was not keeping up with demand, and the pressure on housing has led to central government to really remove that step in and remove the urban boundary requirement. That is a bit unfortunate and from a planning perspective, but it has meant that urban development areas are able to now expand, and you're getting quite a lot more growth in the areas that were set aside for growth, and in also, in where there are opportunities to do so around the edge of the city, which is poor in the terms of urban sprawl and the fact that infrastructure has to then grow to keep up with that, as opposed to reinvesting and reusing the urban land which has already been developed or partially developed. So that is one of the biggest issues at the moment, is keeping pace with that growth. And some examples of that are in the growth areas, a supporting growth alliance that has been formed to plan for those 20 or 30 years in those growth areas by protecting the corridors for rail, road, bus, walking, cycling, transport corridors that can grow, but be protected, and then the growth will be structured around them. So it's those sort of planning activities that are taking place now, with the growth focused on, not only focused on renewal, although that hasn't gone away. There is still quite a substantial focus on that, and the reforms are looking at bringing that more to the fore. Climate resilience is a major issue, and it's been faced by the city. I mean, not too long ago in 2023, we had a series of severe weather events that really resulted in major damage, some death, and really extensive impacts on infrastructure, homes and businesses in Auckland. What it did was really highlight the vulnerability of Auckland's stormwater systems and urban planning, because it had started, especially stormwater systems, had started to age and hadn't really, the infrastructure investment hadn't kept pace with some of the urban demands. There were three events: the Auckland anniversary floods, the Cyclone Gabriel in February, which was only 2 weeks later. Fortunately for Auckland, that probably didn't bear the brunt of it, but parts of the North Island did, or other parts of the North Island did. But because it was only 2 weeks after the anniversary floods, there was quite a lot of damage and flooding resulting from the fact that the ground was already saturated. While those events were big, it was also quite a wet end of summer and into autumn. In 9th of May, there was another storm, heavy rainstorm occurred. And again, because the ground was so soaked and so wet, we had a lot of events or flooding events that resulted as a result of that. So making room for water is something, or making space for water, was an initiative that the council, and with government support, developed to respond to that. So from a planning perspective, that looked at initiatives such as restoring streams, upgrading culverts, creating floodable parks, moving some houses, people moving families and communities out of some high-risk areas and into safer areas, and using those areas or reallocating them for flood management. Those are the sort of responses that have been really encouraging, and while we have the terrible events, it's taught us a lot, and we've been able to draw on a lot of experience to make better space for water when it does occur. So it's more about adaptation, to make room for, particularly for saving lives or avoiding impacts on life. As I mentioned, there is an extensive planning reform process underway. The current government wants to replace the Resource Management Act. It says it is outdated, and there's a number of flaws with it, which largely we think, from a planning perspective, it's more about the fact that there was a lack of real national direction in some areas. It was modified again and again and again, and it's now 3 or 4 times the size it was originally as piece of legislation, and it's become quite clunky and not as efficient as particularly in things like the housing, response to housing and things like that. So there isn't a feeling, I think, that it might be time to revisit it. The current government is looking at 2 new acts, splitting it from an integrated piece into a planning act focused on land use, urban development and infrastructure, and then a legislation. And the two will have to work together, obviously, but the natural environment one will focus more on environmental protection, Maori relationships and natural resources. Housing is another issue the national government or the central government is seeking changes to, and the land use reforms are part of that. The freeing up land that council must enable 30 years of housing capacity in high growth areas is something that is rather surprisingly odd or new to New Zealand. It is something that, as planners, it's a good idea and welcomed, I think. On contrary to that, perhaps the no rural urban boundaries imposes quite or releases quite a constraint on what is quite important if we're trying to get efficiency and sustainable cities from the urban land that we have by allowing that growth to occur or spill over those boundaries. Intensification of mixed-use development is pleasing to see. Again, that's something that we really want to see as valuable particularly for places like Auckland, which are experiencing rapid growth. And also the infrastructure funding tools are a national initiative to try and improve those and to see how that funding for infrastructure so that it keep pace, be upgraded and be useful for a longer period of time can be implemented and funded adequately. So that central government oversight is very important. And and this is all tied up with this current phase of reforms to try and streamline or get more efficiency out of our process. Things like infrastructure, as I've touched on, there's national policy statement for infrastructure. We haven't had one on infrastructure before, so that is quite again an encouraging thing. So it simplifies and speeds up approvals, but also allows for long-term planning and the introduction of things like spatial plans, urban growth partnerships between the central government and its agencies and local government is going to be really helpful for that. National environment standards are also a tool that we've talked about briefly, and that can enable development and things to be guided from a national direction, which is useful for getting consistency across the country and also making sure that the priority is put on some of these what are essential infrastructure needs for our growing communities. Climate resilience is another one. City-wide resilience frameworks, local adaptation plans are again an example of that is in Dunedin, where they're developing city-wide and domain-specific adaptation plans. It's parts of the city are very low-lying on the coast and susceptible to sea level rise. So those sort of, and that's quite often the case around the country, as being an island country. There are a number of our settlements are on the coast and susceptible to climate change events and long-term sea level rise. Resilience strategies being partnering with iwi and hapu and other Māori representation is really important as well, as is the hazard mapping of flood risk and sea level rise. National climate strategy tools have been talked about, an adaptation system, a fair and enduring system to prepare communities for climate impacts. Nature-based solutions are very important, so restoring wetlands or forests to absorb or buffer climate effects, and also ensuring that infrastructure is resilient. The planning tools for that are largely the NPSs and the guides to consider that at a national level. There are climate responsive zonings which could restrict development in high risk areas or allow for adaptation over time. And there's also emission reduction integration, so aligning urban growth with low emissions, encouraging development around transport hubs and so forth. And of course, data and monitoring is going to be very important to supporting that. The environment is, of course, very important in New Zealand. We're blessed with very beautiful landscapes and indigenous fauna and flora. And so it's very much an important part of that integration of the Resource Management Act. So a number of the revisions that are being looked at we've got existing national policy statements on freshwater and biodiversity, but some of how that will balance will be interesting. And I say it's interesting because some of the developments are not clear yet, so we're still in that reform process. And the two acts, as I said, are meant to work together or intended to work together. One, the Planning Act is really focused on urban development and renewable energy and infrastructure. It covers natural hazard management as well and promotes, I suppose, development and property rights and the idea that people can develop if they own a piece of land that is appropriate for housing or residential development. They should be able to do that without being bogged down in a onerous and long drawn out process, which is a lot of the criticism at the moment levelled against the RMA seems to be focused on that. Spatial plans are likely to replace a regional policy statement. So that will also be a useful tool at a regional level to try and get that infrastructure and growth aligned for a region. So that might cross several district boundaries, but for a region. The Natural Environment Act highlights focusing on freshwater biodiversity and landscape. So the regional councils will prepare natural environment plans and the district councils will contribute to a combined district plan that respects those. The urban growth agenda is again focused on improving housing affordability, and so that is encouraging because it's talking about livable and resilient cities. So we might see the opportunity to get more strategic urban planning, better integrated transport and land use, and perhaps coupled with the infrastructure funding and delivery tools to help keep in pace with that growth that occurs. Spatial planning, as I touched on, that long-term integrated approach to land use and infrastructure, and that's going to be key, I think, across regions because they need to work together and with their districts to get an integrated plan. I think it's also going to be important at a national level to actually see how that infrastructure network across the nation can be aligned and investment wisely made. The planning for those investments and development, incorporated into the plans. So the future outlook is a more streamlined national policy direction. There is discussion about one national plan for New Zealand, but I think that's more along the lines of standardised planning for each of the plans across the country, so that there's consistency across the country, with the ability to perhaps tailor some of those areas that are specific to local context or communities or values that are in that community, like heritage and natural values and so forth. There is envisaged to be more collaboration between central and local government, and greater emphasis, I'm not sure, but definitely emphasis on Maori partnerships and environmental stewardship won't go away. So while 2025 looks like a transformative year for us with widespread planning framework reforms, new legislation that aims to balance that development and environmental protection, which has been perceived as maybe not being as constructive to keep up with housing demands, infrastructure demands, energy demands, and especially looking forward to the next 100 years, things like climate resilience. So that becomes really important too in terms of the urban growth agenda to support cities and settlements that will be resilient and sustainable going into the rest of this century and perhaps beyond. That gives you a very summarised version of planning in New Zealand. I hope it's useful as part of this series, and I look forward to engaging with you further through the Commonwealth Association of Planners. Ka kite anō.